I've not been able to have ongoing conversations with very many leaders of the confessional bibliology movement. The attempts just tend to fall apart. But there are definite exceptions, and Robert Truelove is or was one of them. Truelove is no longer active in leadership or advocacy for the TR or the King James, but when he was one with whom I could always converse. And it seemed to me that he had one key argument he kept going back to in favor of the TR. It was an argument by analogy. If I can accept that God's people received the canon of New Testament books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, etc., by means of their use in the churches, why can't I accept the same about the received text, that is, the Textus Receptus, Greek New Testament? This, to me, is a rational argument, and over a year ago, about 2 years ago, I wrote out a reply to it and sent it to Robert. I'll tell you a little bit about his response at the end. It's edifying. I like interaction with Robert Truelove. Here, for your viewing pleasure, are 3 brief reasons why I can't accept Truelove's argument, followed by Robert's reply, used by permission, and a couple more thoughts about IFB TR defenses. But I sent this whole script to him before shooting it. First, applying our, or say Michael Kruger's, understanding of canon to text. It just doesn't get me where I need to go. That's because there are 2 little letters that occur 600 times in the Nestle-Aland 28. PM, standing for pair multi. I'll explain in a minute what that means. A little setup first. 99.9% of the time, textual judgments are needed for small and minor points, like this variant I chose at random in Jude 1:1. Scrivener's TR reads, Jude, the servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James, to them that are sanctified by God the Father and preserved in Jesus Christ and called. The NA28 reads exactly the same, except that it calls the recipients of the letter them that are loved by God the Father, not sanctified. This point is minor because plenty of other New Testament verses tell us we are sanctified by God, including Hebrews 2:11. You can read that on your own. Maybe your view, Robert, helps us when it comes to big chunks like the story of the woman caught in adultery and the so-called longer ending of Mark 16:9-20. But to really work as a theory for textual criticism has to help us with the countless tiny little points that come up in the manuscript history, like the one in Jude 1:1. Even if you have ways of limiting that history down to the Byzantine families, say, or even to just TR editions, you still have differing readings that have been accepted by lots of God's people. The Dutch equivalent of the King James, the 1637 Staten-Vertaling, assumed a different textual basis at a number of points. I mentioned this in a footnote in my Detroit Journal article. How does text as canon help me in these cases where even TRs differ? Did the wise men see baby Jesus or find baby Jesus? If I'm a Bible translator, I have to make a choice. I can't say, look at what God's people have accepted. They accepted both. Now back to PM. Pair multi means that the majority is divided. Just last night, before falling asleep, I was reading the intro to the Robinson-Pierpont majority text, and they openly acknowledge how often the majority is divided. Maurice Robinson, is the world expert on the story of the woman caught in adultery in John 7:53, and he carries on a long tradition of acknowledging the passage itself comes in multiple major forms. That passage comes in more than just 2 forms, and it shows up in several places in the Gospels. There isn't a clear majority reading. We don't know what God's people have received. Or rather, God's people have apparently received all those readings at some places and times. Unless we're prepared to say that the only God's people who matter are us, and that we English speakers or Europeans and what we've received is clearly right, I think we have to acknowledge that the reception argument doesn't answer all the questions we need to answer. Everywhere we look in the Greek New Testament manuscript tradition, in all the evidence God has preserved for us, we see variation. And let's remember what that means. It means that a church in Neuendettelsau, Germany, in 1347, and one in a small town in Egypt in 413, and a bishop in Gaul in 321, and a wealthy believer in Jerusalem in 920, and countless other Christians of varying sorts, of course, some of whom may have had some crazy ideas. Over the centuries, they've accepted and used texts that were mildly different from what others around the known world were accepting. How were they supposed to even know this? What were they supposed to do if, totally unbeknownst to them, the original text said they also may without the word be won by the conversation of their wives, whereas theirs had, they also will without the word be won by the conversation of their wives? I chose this example at random too, but it is an actual example of textual variation in the New Testament. I know that kept pure in all ages isn't really your favorite appeal, Robert, but it's germane here. If the text was kept pure in all ages, then why did God preserve only evidence of impurity, of variation? Second, at what point does the widespread contemporary acceptance around the world of the critical text militate against your view? If, as I've argued, God's people in different countries accept different readings and bear no apparent blame for this, right? Then maybe it's okay that people accept the TRs and the critical text at the same time. TR defenders never seem to me to be very interested in languages other than English, or possibly a smattering of other European languages who had Reformation-era Bibles and therefore a TR-type tradition. 99% of the time, however, what I hear about from TR defenders is Scrivener's TR, which is the English-speaking world's TR because it's the King James. Their calculations about which text has been received by God's people go back down only the English timeline. But how many Bible translation organizations have done translations from the critical text around the world in the last 100 years? It's not at all certain, from my perspective, that God's people around the world are receiving the received texts in greater numbers than they are receiving the critical texts. My gut level guess is that God's people around the world have received the critical text in far more places, and maybe even in greater raw numbers, than they have received the Textus Receptus. I can't know this, that's my gut level guess. Third, where does the Bible tell me to look for the texts that God's people have received? If you acknowledge, Robert, that your view gets you to a textual confidence view and not a textual absolutist view, by the way, Robert acknowledged this to me privately, then I think you have to give up the proof texts that are commonly used to justify the latter. Matthew 5:18 is at the top of the list. If that verse is talking directly, rather than metaphorically or even hyperbolically, about textual preservation, then it has to mean perfection. Absolutely perfect preservation. All the jots and tittles, none missing or added, and all in the right order. But you can't deliver such a text, brother, as you acknowledge. I do not think lack of scriptural support is fatal for your view. I really don't. The Bible doesn't contain the major accepted textual critical canons either, and I still find them generally persuasive, though I absolutely acknowledge that they don't yield certainty in every case. What I do think is that confessional bibliology proponents need to back off of using Matthew 5:18 and certainly Psalm 12:6 and 7. They are heating up the debate by saying that God promised perfect preservation. I like and respect a variant of your argument. I think it's totally reasonable to say, let's just stick with the text God has used in our culture in the last 500 years. You could toss the Reformation in there too, and I'd still be okay with that argument. I don't find it persuasive, finally, but I feel the same way about infant baptism, and yet I'm happy to coexist and cooperate with my Presbyterian brothers without having to constantly bicker about baptism. If we're going to have TR advocates, I'd like the debate to be more like pedo versus credo than orthodox versus heretic. But what is the etymology of heretic? What makes a given error count as a heresy? I do think that the level of division and sin generated by the doctrine has to provide some of that evidence. And I see incredible amounts of division and sin generated by KJV and TR defenses. Yesterday, I heard of two fathers, both pastors, who have disowned their adult Christian sons, and one of them is threatening to, over the King James Version. Both of these were IFB. It's heartbreaking. One of those sons is a pastor who actually preaches from the King James, but who isn't King James only. I hear this kind of thing all the time. In the confessional bibliology world, it's not quite so bad because the proponents of that view are more educated and less afraid of disagreement, in my judgment. I'm glad for this. But I've been repeatedly called a liar, and I mean over and over, by confessional bibliology proponents. I've seen incredible malice and arrogance coming from so many of them, certainly not all. And then you have the other extremes that I named in my video, backing out of public engagement with confessional bibliology. The one that I find most vexing is actually one CB leader's argument that language change in English arises from sin, hence we should stick with the King James Version. This is utterly bizarre. And a top CB leader tweeted out a link to that article. Language change is my specialty. I know with every fiber in my being that these CB figures are not just wrong here, but wildly and impossibly wrong. What is it that has turned so many CB advocates, not all, not you, Robert, into extremists? How can the more moderate voices like you, Robert, predominate when it seems to me the viewpoint consistently gains followers by using textual absolutist arguments? I sent this letter to Robert Truelove, and he responded very graciously. I have asked his permission to share his response with you because it's a model that I'd like to praise. Mark, a quick response, and I'll follow up when I have time addressing some of your key points. For now, you say, if we're going to have TR advocates, I'd like the debate to be more like pedo versus credo than orthodox versus heretic. Amen. I agree 100%. Again, there's a reason why I left the Confessional Bibliology Facebook group and just let my lectures speak for me until someone wishes to engage me on them. I am certain there are many, many far more godly men and women than myself who hold to the critical text. This issue is not the key to heaven, though I believe it is important, and I'm concerned with the ongoing trajectory of things. Robert. Many months later, Truelove contacted me again. He said, Mark, I just watched your video on how to be gracious when haters hate, and I very much resonate with your words. I just want you to know that I love you as a brother, and I appreciate your ministry, even with our text issues. You're very much the sort of person I'd like to interact with on the textual question because I have less and less an appetite for conflicting with personalities and have never seen your interaction on the textual debate as needlessly divisive. That's actually the reason why I've exited the public sphere for some time now. It has been too much of a conflict with personalities, and it seems like most people of either persuasion thrive more on the conflict than the actual issues. I just have less and less of an interest in that. I hope I've never come across to you as an enemy, and I want to apologize if ever that has been the way I've been perceived. That's Christian disagreement, folks. There are times to use harsh words, I think. I used them against Peter Ruckman because he is so overtly wicked and has ripped the throats out of so many of Christ's sheep by causing hateful, bitter, malicious division over his heresies. I feel toward Ruckman the animus that Jesus felt toward the Pharisees, the anger, the righteous anger that led him to fillet them in Matthew 23. I also use some mocking words, quite on purpose, though I think carefully, to describe Brandon Peterson's terribly foolish numerology videos promoting King James onlyism. Those were clear exceptions to my normal practices. But I don't use that kind of speech with confessional bibliology proponent, or former proponent, Robert Truelove, because merely by treating our disagreement as not an obstacle to our Christian fellowship makes that disagreement into something that isn't divisive. Truelove is also gracious and acknowledges good in his opponents, a favor I am eager and delighted to return. He is not an extremist. I have just a few more thoughts I'd like to share here before we close out. I'm kind of cramming these in because I have only a few weeks left before the end of the year, and I have thoughts and notes that I want to share if I can. These are related to what I talked about to Robert Truelove, but they're directed instead at IFB King James onlyism, which uses themes similar to what Robert has argued, but different, as we'll see. Again, I'm sorry for shoehorning them in here, but perhaps you'll see the through line from topic to topic the way I do. There's kind of a standard line of argument that I see King James and TR defenders go through. This is the principle I hear all the time from them to start out with. The text of the Greek New Testament that God has used for 1,800 years is the one we should stick with. I or someone in the evangelical mainstream might reply this way, but what about when that principle fails to get you to a final text, as with the story of the woman caught in adultery? Maurice Robinson, the undisputed king of the Byzantine text form, sometimes called the majority text view, has pointed out, for example, that the story of the woman caught in adultery in John 7:53 to 8:11 has a, quote, complex transmissional history. He points out that one famous Greek scholar, von Soden, identified 7 distinct lines of transmission within this short section of text. But Robinson has looked at every single manuscript of John that contains this passage. He says that von Soden may have underestimated the complexity of its transmissional lines. So we go to step 2 in the argument. What I feel like I usually hear from King James and TR defenders after this is, okay, so there isn't one Greek text God has used for 1,800 years, but we should go with the great majority of available readings. But what do you do when the readings are divided, when there's no clear majority? This is the same argument that you heard me use before with Truelove, of course. Robinson says, quote, von Soden's 3 primary lines of transmission of the story of the woman caught in adultery remain valid and encompass the bulk of the manuscript tradition. Each of these 3 lines, termed by von Soden Mu 5, Mu 6, and Mu 7, retains a near equal level of support. Robinson decided to present the story in the first edition of his Byzantine text as a tentative hybrid, combining elements of Mu 5 and Mu 6, with some readings bracketed. By the latest edition of his text, he decided to use the Mu 5 form as his primary text with its marked alternates in their proper location. The Mu 6 text is displayed separately as an italicized footnote along with its own alternate marginal readings. So yes, God used this story for a long time in a lot of places, but they didn't all have exactly the same form of the story, and there's no clear winner. My IFB interlocutor will then say, okay, go with whatever the TR says. God has clearly used the Textus Receptus. And then I might point out that there are different TRs with different readings in various places. Which one should I use? If I ever get an answer to this, it's nearly always Scrivener's TR. But there are places in Scrivener's TR, especially Revelation 16:5, where not a single Greek New Testament manuscript in existence records the reading adopted in Scrivener. Even E.F. Hills, the best TR defender ever, in my opinion, said, through the influence of the Latin-speaking church, Erasmus and his successors were providentially guided to follow the Latin Vulgate here and there in those few places in which the Latin church usage, rather than the Greek church usage, had preserved the genuine reading. Hence, the Textus Receptus represents a further step in the providential preservation of the New Testament. In it, the few errors of any consequence occurring in the traditional Greek text were corrected by the providence of God operating through the usage of the Latin-speaking church of Western Europe. So, God preserved the right reading in the Latin Vulgate and not in the Greek New Testament manuscripts. Doesn't that militate against the principle we started with, that we should use the Greek New Testament God has used for 1,800 years? At the very least, Hills sure seems to violate the Bible verses used to promote the doctrine of perfect preservation. If, when Jesus gave that jot and tittle promise, he was promising perfect manuscript copies of the Greek New Testament, where is the one that contains Scrivener's TR reading at Revelation 16:5? Why did God need to use Latin to get the true reading? Why couldn't he use Greek? Indeed, as I've pointed out on this channel before, the standard argument that says, well, the Westcott and Hort text didn't exist until 1881, and one of the most terrible ironies in the whole King James debate, the other one being study to show thyself approved, that argument applies to Scrivener. That exact set of jot and tittles never existed in the history of the world until 1881. When people keep retreating from their stated principles when you challenge them, it's difficult not to conclude that underlying all of the supposed principles is another true bedrock, King James onlyism. Whatever the King James says is right. That's the real principle here, the bedrock, practically any time I can get that far in discussion with a TR defender. Back to the first topic of the video. That isn't the case with Robert Truelove. He sees and lives clear differences between King James onlyism and his view. As I come to the end of my discussions of King James onlyism on the popular level at least, December 31st, 2024 will be my last day doing this, Lord willing. I find myself not so much wanting to get off parting shots as parting shapings. I want the debate to continue, if it's going to continue, in a way that's less divisive and less hateful. And a great way to start that would be to talk more like Robert Truelove and less like the current leaders of confessional bibliology.